Welcome to Beyond the Surface. On our podcast, we highlight underrepresented voices in architecture. We'll humanize architects by uncovering who they are beyond the surface. Hi, I'm your host, Alex Sanchez, representing the Illinois Tech student chapter of the National Organization of Minority Architects. Today's episode is called Designing Healthy Communities with our guest, Dawveed Scully. Dawveed Scully is Managing Deputy Commissioner of Planning and Development at City of Chicago. Prior to joining City of Chicago, Dawveed was an associate principal in urban design and planning studio at Skidmore, Owings, and Merrill in Chicago. He is a licensed architect in the state of Illinois and AICP certified urban planner. Dawveed is a graduate and adjunct professor at IIT College of Architecture and recognized with the Urban Land Institute Chicago Young Visionary 2018 Award, featured in Crane Chicago Business 40 Under 40 in 2020. And Leadership Greater Chicago Class of 2021 Fellow. Thank you for taking your time to be here today with us. We appreciate having you as a guest. How are you feel today?
Yeah, I'm feeling good. Excited to always be back on campus. When I started at IIT, MTCC had just opened, so it's always nice to come back and see how it's grown and into use over the years.
Definitely. This building is not that old, which surprised me when I first came here, but yeah, it's really nice to have you here. So we'll get started with the interview. Can you talk a little bit about your background and how that influenced who you are today?
Sure. So I grew up in Chicago. So it was interesting coming to architecture school. I was one of the only students who had grew up here. I grew up on the south side of Chicago in the South Shore and in Auburn Gresham. I went to Morgan Park High School here on the far south side. And then I actually took classes at city colleges before coming to IIT. So I was a transfer student into IIT's architecture program. But I really developed my love of architecture in high school, taking drafting classes, and it kind of gave me a place to really merge the scientific sort of interest that I had, as well as the sort of practical artistry. And I love the tangibility of architecture. Like at the end, you end up with a product that people live in and occupy and leverage and use in certain ways. So you're having to kind of operate in a lot of different places. I was fortunate to, after high school, get an internship through the Newhouse Architecture program. So actually, as a 17-year-old, just finished high school, got to work at Getch Architects for a summer in 2002. And that was a really great experience. It really solidified like, oh, I can do this. I'm working at this firm now. They're doing stuff. For a while, they had me just doing intern stuff, like organizing the materials library and that sort of thing. But they didn't know I was really good at like CAD and 3D Studio Max already as a student. So once they like figured that out, then they're like, oh, help us with these renderings or like work on this floor plan. So it was a great experience to really like help me know that this is something that I really want to do.
I feel like you were really pushed into the architectural even from a young age, right? Mm-hmm. So that's really good for like the experience. So how did you feel going from that into college all over again? Because I know most people don't really experience work life before
college.
College. So how did it feel going from that work life to college?
I thought it was actually pretty easy for me. It was work, but it was like, it was a summer. So it wasn't like practicing for several years and then kind of came back to school. So it was enough of a taste to kind of understand what the field was. But I still needed the bones of what do architects do, like how to look at structures, how to understand these ideas that you may have and how to actually bring them to life. So architecture school was super helpful for me to start to dive more into the actual field itself and understand and create and sort of idea on my own. Especially as a young kid, they trust you with only so much because your knowledge is limited. So there it was more about like, okay, here's a task, execute the task. Whereas architecture school, it's like, okay, what's the idea that you're trying to portray? And it's on you to really push that forward. There wasn't too big of a transition, but it definitely helped to have that experience and kind of know like, okay, I've survived somewhat in a professional environment now to get to learn the skills and the elements that I really need to become an architect in the future.
And going from that, you had an internship experience, but did you have any other role models or mentors that helped you with architecture?
I would say maybe not mentors, but definitely I think role models. Growing up in Chicago, there is sort of a general cognizance of architecture. So whether it's like PBS specials with Jeffrey Bear and that sort of thing going around, like, like, okay, Frank Lloyd Wright or Daniel Burnham, those folks, you are kind of in the sphere. So it was understanding and kind of seeing kind of the impact that some of those people had and seeing their work in real time. And then I think when I was growing up, the then Sears Tower, now the Willis Tower, was the tallest building in the world. So like I had a lot of reverence for SOM after I learned that firm that designed that is actually here in Chicago. Like, that's really cool. So a lot of, I think, just understanding from that perspective. And then I think my drafting teacher in high school was definitely a big influence. Frank Lamontia, who was a Chicago guy, really, I think, helped us just have opportunities, even though he wasn't an architect by background, but he understood and was teaching us the craft of drafting. Gave us a lot of opportunities to study. So I actually got to take not just drafting class with him in high school, but there's a program in Chicago called Upward Bounds for high school students. So it lets you take college level courses while you're still in high school, and you get both college and high school credits. So I was taking like Autodesk Inventor. I was taking like classes around more detailed CAD and 3D modeling classes. A lot of times with folks who were doing their continuing education. So it was like 30 and 40 and 50-year-olds, and then I'm like this 16-year-old kid just hanging out and getting to kind of talk to these professionals. So I learned a lot of skills, I think, through that, and definitely Mr. Lamontia was a great influence on that.
It feels like you started your career at a very young age due to these like mentors, role models, and the people you definitely looked up to. All the experience you were able to even gain before college put you ahead of the game. So did that make college easier for you?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, I definitely had, because I had skills already, it was easier for me to move through some of the classes, especially the ones that were more about like the tactics and techniques. Like when you're just starting to learn CAD. I'd already been doing CAD for years and years and years. It was pretty easy. And because I transferred in, they took a lot of my credits for some of those classes. So I didn't have to take sort of like intro to AutoCAD or like that sort of thing. I was able to do like advanced 3D Max classes or BIM classes kind of right off the bat. So those sort of things were super helpful. But when I got to IT, and I'm not sure if the curriculum's still the same the first and second year, because I didn't have any studio credits, I had to still do the whole 5 years. So I had like 40 credits coming in, but I still had to be a full-time student. So I had to mix in electives while I was there. But the first 2 years were all hand drafting. So I had hand drafted, in high school. That's kind of how we started, but this was definitely a whole different ball game with kind of lines and like bigger format drawings. And then especially second year at IT when I was here was the Brick Studio and then the Wood Studio. So Brick Studio, you had about, I want to say 25 or 30 sketches, problems, which ended in the brick floor plan. And the brick floor plan is a brick plan. I don't know if you've seen the drawings because I'm sure they have some laying around, but it's 1/8 inch on 30 by 40 Strathmore scale brick floor plan, and you draw every single brick down to the 1/8 inch mortar joints between the bricks. So it takes like a week and a half of just like being in Crown Hall and drawing. So that sort of thing, I don't think there's anything that can prepare you to do that.
The curriculum has definitely changed.
Yeah, like it's a lot of that's a lot of work. I still actually have mine at home. I'm gonna like mount it one day when I have time to do it. But yeah, I still have all of those drawings just because they took so much work to do. It's like, I'm not throwing these away at all. But that stuff that's hard to really prepare for. But I learned a lot from it, which was super helpful.
Yeah. You mentioned earlier that during college, you were one of the few students from here in Chicago. Can you tell us how that impacted you as a student?
Yeah, I think, there was definitely growing up in the city proper. There were a lot of folks from the area, but who grew up in the city, grew up in the South Side, that sort of thing. There were, very few in my class, and then in the school at large. There were a couple of us sort of spread through the years. But it definitely, I think, shaped my perspective, especially learning about the history and legacy of architecture and urban planning and how that shapes cities at large, which is one of the things that really got me into urban planning and regional planning as an interest while I was a student. I learned about Corbusier and the Radiant City, and you learn about Broadacre City and Frank Lloyd Wright and those really sort of big theories that folks had about living and how those things impacted then real cities in real time. The creation of the highway system in the United States, the creation of the urban grid in a lot of places, transportation. It kind of gradates when you go from East Coast to West Coast, right? Like the East Coast, which are older cities, tend to have more walkable, transit-oriented sort of neighborhoods and spaces. And then from East to West, that fades off. There's a reason for that. So learning all of those things and growing up in it and kind of seeing the impact of it in the city kind of in real time. I mean, we're sitting in the campus of IIT, which was part of urban renewal in the city of Chicago. So those sort of things, learning about that really and seeing it and then sort of being able to trace back the things that I've gone through as someone living here was really just informative and shaped me and my interest in architecture in a different way than some of the other students.
There really is not that many people from Chicago, which is kind of like, it's very sad because they're the future architects. They're people that are most likely going to build the city, but they don't fully understand it. And I feel like that also sets you apart from other designers because you grew up here, you know the people you're designing for versus people who are coming here blindly and only know what's on a plan.
Yeah.
They only know things that they're like looking at from the Chicago grid system, and they're not really understanding the people that live there, and you have more of an experience with that. So I feel like that all your lived experience, you're able to gather all that and use that towards what you design. So going from there, when do you feel like you were first drawn to urban planning?
Yeah, I would say it was probably our second or third year of architecture school. We were taking, the various architecture history classes, and then I was able to get into some of the electives. I don't know if they still have it, but they had a minor in city and regional planning. So there were a couple of classes that really fit into that. So I took some of those classes, and it was really interesting and kind of eye-opening to understand, that urban planning is like a thing, because I didn't really know of it as a field, and how much that has an impact on cities and the context that architects work in, right? So architects, we're engaging the building code, we're engaging the zoning code, and we're looking at the context of the place that we're in, but understanding and layering on things like redlining, things like urban renewal that happen, kind of these historic law cases or structures that have been sort of designed to make a city operate in the way that it is. And that was really interesting to me to see that as a field and part of the field of architecture and design and being able to shape cities at large. The other thing that happened that was super informative was between the end of third year going into fourth year, I actually was able to start an internship at SOM in the city design practice. Then with Phil Inquist, who was the partner over urban planning, and actually a couple of my classmates at IIT. So it was like four of us brought in really to support the studio with skills. Like we're, young and interesting skills around 3D modeling and visualization and that sort of thing. So it was interesting to kind of go into that practice, which at that time was like, there was so much work. It was like 2008. So there was so much work in the Middle East and there was so much work in China. Like all of that stuff was starting to open up. '08 was the Beijing Olympics. So it's like, okay, you had like the bird's nest and all this other kind of really interesting stuff happening there. And then to go into this practice and to like literally see them designing whole districts and like complete new cities was just kind of like mind blowing. It's like, whoa, like they did a country master plan for Bahrain. Like, master planned a country, like, wow, like that's insane. And then we were at the same time still doing work in Chicago, and there was projects that I got to work on, like someone did the master plan for the Riverwalk downtown. Like a lot of people know that, and I got to work on, like I did the plan drawing that still, is in the report today for the Riverwalk, and then that was taken by Ross Barney and Sasaki and those folks to actually design the elements of the Riverwalk. So like to see the planning work and then how that then translated into action on the design side really clicked for me. Is like, okay, this is a way that you can have impact at a large scale and at a space before architecture is actually happening. Like planning tends to set the stage for architecture to happen. If you have bad planning and bad zoning or just bad regulations in general, you end up with bad urbanism and bad architecture. So how to really set the structure for then architecture to fall into was something that really became super interesting and kind of led me down working in both architecture and urban planning.
I find it interesting that that's what inspired you to do urban planning. And I didn't know how big SOM's urban planning field was. So that's a lot.
Yeah.
Especially like the master plannings. I was like, that's a lot. Can you talk about what your path was like between architecture and urban planning?
Sure. So like for me, it was pretty seamless. Like I don't see, and you'll hear this a lot from folks who have studied in South America or in Europe, is that they tend to teach them actually together as a collective thing. And it's something that's a little bit different in the US, that we sort of have like an architecture school and an urban planning school and a landscape architecture school. It's like they're all interconnected, and urban design tends to kind of be where they all meet up, because it is more about the placemaking and the experience of how you are in a city. So a lot of that really set me up to kind of work in both spaces. Like I was still finishing up my architecture degree, so I was doing the 4th and 5th year elective studios. I think you still have to do the comprehensive building design studios. So we're doing those projects, as well as finding opportunities to try out urban design, urban planning. The architecture knowledge helps so much, even though most of the work that I do now is on the like urban design, urban planning scale. It helps a lot to be able to A, speak the language, but then B, understand like, okay, this is how you like build something. Because that's super important, and that's not something that everybody really understands. And to be able to take things from like, okay, really, really, really big scale thinking around connections and how things move and how things operate, how big is the block, how do you break the block down into developable parcels, and then how does that translate into architecture and development, and how do you then create places that may be new but either reflect a cultural context as well as a physical context of where they are. So a lot of that things that I learned in architecture about creating space and framing and experience and how people move through a space, how to leverage and understand the use of a space and how form follows function and those sort of things, and then how that then connects with the built environment. So a lot of the work that we'll do is trying to understand like, okay, how does the building hit the ground? How does the building interface with the street? So where does the frontage of the building go? How far should it set back from the street? How does it reflect and engage with the building across the street? Are we creating memorable and usable public spaces for residents and community folks? Or what's the public benefit to the architecture? There's a lot of those things that really help bounce back and forth between. So learning a little bit of both really helped me tremendously.
I love that you say that in other countries they teach everything like if it's one whole, because it really is. That's how you build a city. I feel like that would also change the way other designers see architecture, urban design, landscape. You said it all pretty much comes all together. And I feel like you explained it very well. I feel like not many people see design that way, when most of the things that you were talking about can apply to all three of them. Mm-hmm. And I feel like you're able to see it that way because you have expanded your knowledge outside of just architecture. That's very powerful for how you design as well. So as a designer, you have had like this opportunity to put all the different pieces of this puzzle together to be able to design for other people. With an understanding of different scales of design between architecture and urban planning, how did you begin to see that impact the communities you grew up in?
Yeah, I think it impacted my understanding of community in a great deal. I grew up in South Shore, which is far south. It's right south of Jackson Park, sort of in the city. There's South Shore's Cultural Center, which is there. I grew up closer to Stony Island, the western portion of it. Actually, where I think it's like a block away from where Barack Obama's first headquarters as a senator was on 71st Street. So it was a fairly dense community relative to Chicago, a lot of walk-ups and 3 and 6 and 8 unit buildings. But also there's parts like the Jackson Park Highlands that have double lots and sort of larger houses. And that's where like Jesse Jackson and Wendell Campbell, who's one of the founders of NOMA, that's where they live. So it's a pretty mixed community. community and it has some density to it, but there was also vacancy. Like we lived in an apartment building that was right next to a pretty large vacant lot. So to think about things like, okay, 20 years later, there's still this vacancy that you see all over the city. And it's more pronounced in places like Brownsville and places like Inglewood, where there were either like CHA housing that was torn down. We're right here on State Street, where you had on the north, the Harold Ickes homes, which were there when I was growing up, but they tore those down. They tore down the Stateway Gardens, and then they tore down the Robert Taylor homes. And they also tore down the IDB Will homes over on King Drive. So you have like some areas that are like big swaths of vacancy that were once public housing that were supposed to be regenerating those areas that haven't really totally come back. Like you can kind of see it some with the Stateway Gardens, Park Boulevard stuff on 35th where the Starbucks and all that stuff is. That was just opening when I got here in 2005 at IIT, but there's so much more space. And I think sometimes in community and talking to folks, there is an understanding of the vacancy not being a matter of policy, but being a matter of either internalized sort of like, oh, they're not taking care of the community, or folks who live there don't care about trash on the ground or that sort of thing. So it becomes sort of almost like a dog whistle sort of thing. But when you start to learn about the process and the issues and the policies that have like led to these things, you understand, okay, this is not a matter of personal accountability. There are structures designed to allow for people to make it difficult for development to happen in those areas, as well as to make it and incentivize vacancy. So for instance, like I think they recently got rid of it, but there was a vacancy tax break that you essentially got. If you owned vacant property or owned vacant retail space, you could write that off of your taxes as long as you were like, well, we tried to find people, we couldn't find anybody, give me a tax cut. So they could get dramatically lower taxes because they were an unimproved vacant lot. So a lot of people who don't live here, don't live in the city, they live in other states or that sort of thing, they own property in a lot of the communities, and they don't have any incentive to release it back or to sell it or to allow for it to be developed. So that's why entities like the Cook County Land Bank exist, because there's also things that happen which are not necessarily anyone's fault, but let's say someone who lived here, they had a daughter, a family or whatever, their family moved to other places. They moved to Florida or Texas or Indiana or wherever, or to the suburbs. And let's say the person who was living in the house passed away, they buried their relative and they kind of moved on. They may have like forgotten about this property that's here. So there's issues like zombie title where it's like, okay, we can't track down these owners of this property or the descendants of this owner. What do you do with it? So Cook County Land Bank has the ability as the taxing body to clean up those things. And it takes time, but they're able to do it. So it takes building structures to address those critical issues that create vacancy and disincentive to invest in a place. But that learning and going through the process of learning about architecture, learning about urban planning, learning about policy, and then being able to then go back to the neighborhoods that I grew up in and the places that I explored and being like, oh, that's why this exists this way. Why is the air quality an issue? Well, let's look at the land use pattern. Let's look at historically why they decided to place the Dan Ryan Expressway where it is. Like, that's a very intentional thing. And you learn that the patterns of urban development weren't just people making guesses. Sometimes they are, like parking ratios were like literally, like when you learn about like parking and transit engineering, like historically, they made a lot of stuff up. And that's documented. I'm not like throwing anybody under a bus. That they did like kind of make some guesstimates, and a lot of those things stuck. And that's why like big shopping centers have these massive parking lots that are mostly empty most of the time. And somebody was like, oh yeah, this needs parking this way. There's a lot of entities that are starting to break this stuff down, and they are interesting to understand, but it really helped me like really frame the neighborhoods that I grew up in and to be able to come back to those communities and to be able to both share information, because a lot of folks don't know, they live in their daily lives. They're not engaged in urban planning and theory and policy and that sort of thing. They just want a grocery store in their neighborhood. They want affordable housing. So they want jobs that are accessible to people. They want to be able to go to a nice restaurant in their neighborhood. So how to facilitate that kind of becomes then the motive that I've really taken up, and how to help to support those things.
You were able to see the impacts. I have a question though. Did it ever make you angry when you kind of like saw everything and just like that? Like,
yeah, it's definitely very like kind of mind blowing. Like, wait, what? That was a strategic
purpose?
thing. Like somebody just did this and was like, yeah. I don't know if you ever like read redlining maps. Like you're like, what the hell? They got to sit here and just write this. And apparently, so the redlining maps that are online that most people have documented are the Home Ownership Loan Corporation. They don't exist anymore. But apparently there were two sets of redlining maps, theirs and then HUD's. And nobody can find HUD's. They don't exist anymore. Nobody can find any evidence, blah, blah, blah. But it's like that sort of stuff happens. And you're just like, oh, this wasn't well-intentioned things. These were like very intentional decisions that people made. And that's why it's important to understand and to engage from the political side to the elected officials and the commissioner levels, and those sort of folks really matter because their impact can be felt. I mean, you look at like a Robert Moses where, whoa, like this guy basically could like back down the mayor of New York. There are very few people that could really stop him from doing what he wanted to do other than like Jane Jacobs. Like that was kind of it. Like even the mayors had a difficult time with him. So to see that level of power and that intent. And then when you look at and you travel, and I've done work in a lot of cities, you end up with seeing like, okay, most, if not all of the major highways in the United States went through Black and brown neighborhoods. Like that's just what they did. In Detroit, it was Black Bottom. Here in Chicago, Brownsville, as well as Garfield Park and North Lawndale on the west side. And Milwaukee, same thing. And kind of the pattern of most of the places where it's just like, well, what's the least valuable place? Well, we can just move them and we can ram this highway through.
You're able to see all these impacts and form an opinion on what type of things you want to design. So as an urban designer, what do you envision for the communities you design?
Yeah, I think for me, it comes down to kind of more of a feeling than a specific form or like morphology. Like I tend to really want to create, and this is something I learned at kind of working at SOM, it's like start with principles, because the principles will allow you to guide yourself and understand what is going to actually fit into the vision from a physical perspective and what doesn't. So a lot of the things I work on are like, how do we create joy in the neighborhood? How do we create cultural resonance and engage the spirit of a neighborhood? How do you create prosperity in a place? And that requires understanding the ecosystem of a neighborhood and then developing a design solution or policy solution or, how all those things come together to actually have an impact. So, for instance, we did a project in the village of Robbins, Illinois, which is a south suburb. It was actually the first incorporated town in the state of Illinois, formed predominantly as African American. They had the airstrip. They trained folks for the Tuskegee Airmen. So it has like this really rich history of folks from there. And they had an issue around like flooding. So their town, they have basically a channel that goes through, and it used to be a wetland, and it went to the Calsag Channel and the Little Calumet River. And I want to say like the 60s or the 70s, the Army Corps of Engineers filled it in, and then they made it do a 90-degree turn. So with climate change and that sort of thing, it floods. Like there's this whole area, like 30% of the town floods now. So the solution we came up with, they initially were figuring out, okay, how do we solve the flooding? And they started with working with engineers, and the engineers were like, we could do a detention pond over here, or we could do a detention pond over here. And we're going to have to buy these people's houses and tear them down and do this sort of thing. And you don't want to already displace people in a place that has just horrible health outcomes when you have vacant land in the place that floods, because the houses that they got tired of flooding, so they just tore them all down. So what we ended up designing, is under construction right now, was a park. And the park is designed to flood when they need it to, but in the rest of the time, it's for recreational use, it's for attraction, it's to talk about the history of the neighborhood and the community. And we did a lot of community engagement workshops with youth. I work with a really great landscape architecture practice, Living Habitats, and Robert Rock, who just formed his own practice, to really look at like, how do you do development or address an issue in a way that is not just addressing the issue, but is creating potentially a cultural impact or economic impact or a social impact. Like those things are really important in how I practice design, and to have those other ripple effects are kind of critical. Like it can't just be, you need affordable housing, here's affordable housing, but like how does that actually add up to a neighborhood? Maybe you need different scales of housing. Maybe we need to look at missing middle. Maybe we need to understand, the need for open space and play. Does this neighborhood have cultural events and things that really need to be celebrated that need a space to actually live? And it takes that sort of deeper dive and working hand in hand with community that really, I think, creates lasting impact. Because at the end of the day, as an architect or urban planner, et cetera, like you don't live there. So you often finish your project and you're done. As much as you want to support and sort of address issues, like you have a finite time to have an impact. And the folks who live there are going to have some sense of ownership of it. So like a lot of the work is like, how do you instill that sense of ownership with community and create things that they have an investment in to engage and protect and support and grow moving forward?
I really like your response because I feel like I do like how you stopped the tearing down of the houses. That's what I'm saying, that like because you're able to understand what that feels like, you understand those experiences, you're able to stop it from happening to other communities. You're able to guide those type of decisions in like what you would have wanted to have happened in the community you grew up in. So I feel like those experiences you have even brought to the table as an urban designer, designing communities that maybe they don't need things to be torn down. Maybe they do need a park. Mm-hmm. Maybe they need a place where people can gather, where people can have a recreational space, but still allows nature to do its thing.
Yeah. And then a lot of that comes from talking and engaging with community and being there in respectful and supportive, empathetic sort of way. Because I mean, and this is the term, it's often heard in planning. I don't know if you hear it much in architecture, but it's called tokenism. And basically there's a urban theorist that created this. It's called the ladder of participation. And ladder participation goes from basically like you're not listening to anybody, and then there's like true engagement participation. But in that ladder is tokenism, where it's like folks will come out and they'll be like, okay, we're going to listen to community, but they're listening to community, but they're going to do whatever they want anyway. Or they're listening to try and like steer to a pre-existing sort of outcome. Like, we really want to do this, so we're going to try and steer the conversation or the people to agree to this thing. So we often want to be there and engage people authentically in a way that their experience and their expertise, their lived experience being in a place is respected and engaged. And we are bringing our experience as architects, designers, planners to help them translate and to help inform. And that it creates that cycle of they have a very strong knowledge of what's going on, but we also have a strong knowledge of what's successful, what are the roadblocks and barriers to implementing something and getting something to the finish line. So it's a dialogue and it's a working in tandem that is super important.
The work you do is mending the trust between the people and the city itself. Since, like you said earlier, there's people who feel like they're not necessarily being listened to, or it goes over their head, or it's like it ends up just being an argument of trying to convince them that a certain solution is right. But with being more authentic, you're able to actually have people feel like they're being listened to and trust in the city again.
Yeah, the trust is, you hit it right on the head. The trust is a big, big one. Because so many folks, they developed a mistrust because they've been like blatantly lied to in the past. So like, you think about it with the CHA things, like they were supposed to have rebuilt all of the housing units for the CHA residents through the Hope 6 program. And that started 20 plus years ago. I think they're only at like 15 or 20% of the housing units that are there. And people were told like, oh, this is going to be temporary. You're going to be moved to here and then you'll be able to move back. So when people then hear, or they may have moved to different parts of the city, they may have moved to the suburbs or that sort of thing. And then let's say, so I live in Woodlawn currently where the Obama Presidential Center is being built. You have folks who were moved from Bronzeville to Woodlawn in that time. And now it's like, okay, the Presidential Center is coming. Things are starting to raise. There's some of the newer housing developments. They had a house that sold for like $900,000. So it's raising and people are seeing that and they're like, whoa, what's going on? And so there isn't that trust that people have in like, okay, this is the strategy that's going to work for me. They don't trust it. So you really have to be there and understand that. And it takes time. Sometimes you just got to get yelled at, and you have to come through enough for people to really say, like, okay, you know what? We know we yelled at you that first time, but you kept showing up and doing your thing and listening to us, and we're seeing ourselves in what we've told you through the process, but you also explained and illuminated some things that we didn't know. So to have that sort of thing, that outcome is what I really strive for and work towards in all of the work that I do.
And I bet it impacts communities a lot more because you're also able to be more authentic with them. It really does build that relationship.
Yeah.
Now that we've spoken on design philosophy, why don't we talk about how that impacted you at SOM and paved the way in your career towards the Department of Planning?
Sure. So while I was at SOM, so I was there almost 14 years, from 2008 as an intern, started full-time in 2011, the Urban Design and Planning Studio, and probably for the first 6+ years of being at SOM as an intern and as a young designer, a lot of the work was international. So I did a lot of work in China. I did a lot of work in sort of the Middle East, Oman, and Saudi Arabia, projects over there. And there were a couple of kind of highlights. The Michael Reese development. We did a plan for the city 2012 on the old Michael Reese Hospital site, which is not too far away from IIT's campus. And historically, IIT and the Michael Reese Hospital were kind of the two anchors of this neighborhood, and they have this modernist roots. So they were responsible for a lot of the urban renewal and development that happened here, from Lake Meadows and Prairie Shores and all that stuff. So that hospital closed in late 90s, early 2000s, I believe, and it was slated for the Olympic Village in 2008-9 for the 2016 Olympics, which we did not win. Brazil won. But the city bought it. The city bought this old hospital site. And so I got to work on that as a project. And that was one of the ones at SOM which really allowed me to start doing community engagement. Because a lot of the international work, it is very transactional. It's very much like we're over here, we're working with our Shanghai office, we're producing design work and documents, and that's getting over to that team. They work on it sometime, it will come back to us, and then we'll have a presentation. And with some of those projects in like China, like they are like moving fast. Like we had projects that they were building while we were like designing it. So they'd be like, this road is already under construction, and this road is, and we sold these 2 parcels, so those are already under construction, but the rest of it, you can like do your thing. So that sort of stuff would happen, which is very different from here, where it's like, okay, we're doing like a plan and we're doing community engagement meetings and talking about what the potential uses are. We're doing like a market study to understand what's happening. So you're working with some really interesting consultants and other fields. So that was a super transformative experience for me. And then got to actually work in the London office, moved to London for like 6 months, 2013. Worked on some different projects in Europe, and they also did a lot in the Middle East, so I got to do that. And then it probably was like 2015 that a lot of my work shifted to the US. And we're doing campus master planning work, we're doing neighborhood design, community planning work. And that really, I think, set my trajectory as sort of like an experienced designer through now, like getting to do thing kind of community centered type projects, whether it's like the Michael Reese Hospital turned into Brownsville Lakefront development, and got to go from doing the planning work with the city, but then we were on a team with a developer to actually develop the site. So going through that exercise, and that's under construction right now on the infrastructure side. But then also seeing, kind of all these other projects happening, working at University of Chicago. I worked on the Obama Presidential Center master plan that they did and their submission for the actual center itself. Getting to work in Detroit, which was one of the one of the early projects that I got to really lead the design work on. I worked on a lot, but this one I was okay, you're responsible for looking at this entire East Riverfront district, going to community meetings and interfacing with folks. So it was myself and one of the project managers. We had a team out there, and then the urban design principal. So we worked really closely together on that. And then got to work in Atlanta, Detroit, Milwaukee, a little bit in LA, more in Chicago, some in Austin, Texas, some stuff on the East Coast as well. But to really get to expand that experience. And then that really led me into the work at the city. So in 2022 was when I decided to take the leap to take this position at the city of Chicago. Maurice Cox, who was the planning director in Detroit for the Detroit work that we did. So that's where I met him at. And then when he came to Chicago, he reached out and was like, hey, I have this position, really would love you to, as a Chicagoan, to come and bring your expertise to. So I decided to take the leap and shift from the private sector, where we did a lot of really good work, and that work is important. It was interesting. It was an interesting opportunity to try something a little different. We're not doing fee-for-service work. We're responsible for the city at large and what's going to happen with this site over here, how to support the 50 aldermen that are doing various things in their neighborhoods and for their constituents, working with the mayor's office. So it's a different space, and I felt like it was the right time to try a different experience. And government work is something I definitely would recommend for folks in design, because it's a place where you get to see a little bit of everything that's happening in the city. Even as an architect living and working here and working at a firm, I didn't realize just the depth and the breadth of the work that happens and the projects that are going on all over the city. So this really gave me a lens and a space to run a team. So my position at the city is managing deputy commissioner. So I lead the entire planning and design team for the whole city of Chicago. And then I have 2 deputy positions under me, and one has a team that works on the central region, the northwest region, and the north region of the city. And then the other deputy has the west region, the southwest region, the far south region, and the southeast region of the city. So we broke the city into 7 regions. Each region has a team, and that spirals up to me kind of leading that group. And there's definitely things that are more tangential to the work that I do, but there's also things that I have to do now. I make the budget for our team, and we have to find, what's the staffing sort of plan? Can we get more people? We have to put together and kind of make the case for planning. And one of the things digging into the city and kind of learning more about how the city, particularly the Department of Planning, was designed to work until probably the last 2 commissioners. I think the previous 2 or 3 commissioners of the Department of Planning were not planners or architects. They were the previous 2 were, I think, both real estate attorneys. And they structured the department in a way, and this also, I think, spirals down from the mayor and how they want to operate and that sort of thing, and who they put in as commissioner and how that apparatus works. But it was designed as a very transactional department. So it was really about approving plan developments and financing. And every once in a while there might be a little something on the south or the west side. Alderman wants a community center or that sort of thing. They would figure out how to make it happen. But there wasn't a strategic planning apparatus that was focused and dedicated. It's we're going to look at the neighborhood. We're going to create neighborhood plans, and those plans will have community input, and those are to be implemented to achieve a specific goal or objective. And we also didn't have funding tools that operated in that way. So in Chicago, we're a little unique in that we have, I don't know if you heard much about TIF districts, tax increment financing districts, are essentially a levy on the increased tax revenue. It's basically like you're calculating the increased tax revenue over a 23-year period in a specific geography. And then you're leveraging the projected tax revenue to fund a project in the now. So you're saying like, okay, if we do this project, it's going to increase the revenue of this area by X. So we can take that, use it to fund the project, and then it's going to pay itself back plus some interest in 23 years. So that's how it works. And we have all these districts, and some of them are like very successful, and some of them are not so successful, and they don't generate that much income. But that's a primary tool that we use to subsidize projects. And this is another thing I learned being able to work on these more complex projects and work with economists and that sort of thing, is that you start to pick up the economy of architecture and how projects are funded, and that's super important. If you have the time or opportunity, it's worth starting to kind of dig into that, because it'll allow you to think differently about architecture. Because usually when a developer comes to an architect, let's say it's a residential project, they know how many units they need because they've already run their pro forma, and they're like, we need to do 300 units and we're going to charge an average rent of $1,500 a month or $2,000 a month or something like that, and that's going to pay back our debt and equity and blah, 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 and it's going to make our 19 or 20% profit or whatever, kind of they project it for their investors. They know that already. So like they're coming to the architect for a very specific task of like, design me a building that fits into my projected construction costs, and you're going through that, you're going through the VE process, that sort of thing. There's so much in that helps you be a better architect that it's worth kind of diving into. But what tends to happen in areas that are disinvested is that the cost of construction outweighs the market price that you can charge in that area. So you end up with basically a negative equation that you are never going to be able to make the money back that you're going to invest in developing residential building on the south or the west side, or an office building. Like, you're never going to be able to make it back. So what happens is it means you need subsidy from the city or the government, whether that's a tax abatement, whether that's a TIF investment, and that has certain constraints to it, whether that's like a grant, to actually bridge that gap. And that's why you don't see investment in certain areas, because that equation is upside down and there's not any tools to help to bridge that gap and to create opportunity for investment to happen. And this is something like people don't talk about with community. So community is just like, well, nobody wants to come here because we're not directing them to invest in this neighborhood. It's like, no, it's the equation of how development works. And we need to create tools that allow us to address that in a different way. So currently we have all these TIF districts, but like I said, some of them don't make that much money. So then you don't have money to actually invest in an area. And that comes with a lot of strings attached as far as taking that money. So there's things like that you pick up working at the city, working with folks in the Economic Incentives Division, folks in the Small Business Division, talking to the alders who are hearing it from their constituents and their residents every day. And they're like, well, how do we do this thing? Or how do we find opportunity along this street because we're really struggling? How do we support this small business? So you're leveraging your skills in a much different way. So it's helpful to do it for a little bit of time. It doesn't have to be a whole career. But it's definitely been a strong learning experience for me. Even the things that I knew, I've added to that tenfold, just kind of being in the city and working with the commissioner, with first Commissioner Cox and the previous administration, now the Johnson administration, and Commissioner Boatwright, who's planner and developer. So that it's really great to be able to just focus on the neighborhood, to get to walk out and be like, that's an issue. Who owns that? Do we own it? Let's figure it out. And you start to work through things that are happening. And it becomes a much more about creating institutional knowledge and institutionalized processes that are much more equitable than what was done in the past. Again, it comes down to like those systems being designed as inaccessible and untransparent, opaque. And us trying to figure out, okay, how do we address that and make things that are transparent and accountable and accessible and empowering to people.
I find it interesting that like your experience at both locations were so different, But it seems like no matter where you worked, you were still able to appreciate all the experience from those jobs. Especially like I did not know how the department of planning worked. So honestly, hearing that you were an urban planner in both locations, but your experience at the department of planning was so different compared to SOM is really cool. I've been able to learn so much from this conversation so far because it has opened my eyes to like a different world of planning and designing overall. Going from all the experiences that you have so far, what advice would you give to younger designers and students?
I would definitely say, find time to be kind of in community. One of the things that's really helped me was like just going out sometimes and doing things. Because we often are around other designers, we don't often appreciate the skill set that designers and architects have. And we have the ability to vision things that can then be tangible in reality. And not everybody can do that. And sometimes it's super helpful for people to be able to talk about something and you sketch out a little something, and it'll be like, oh, yeah, that makes sense. Like, it's such a valuable sort of skill set to have. And there's always sorts of community events and charrettes and things that different organizations are having around design that's super helpful for you to just participate in, make friends, share ideas, because it is valuable and necessary. And then I would say also participating in professional organizations like NOMAS, it's been tremendously helpful. So like I joined NOMAS when I was in school, didn't stay a NOMA member until I got out of school, and I was out of school for a couple of years and then I reconnected. But for instance, I joined in '08, went to the conference, NOMA conference in DC, and I met Steve Lewis, who was, I believe, the outgoing president at that time. And Steve was also a really good friend of Maurice. In Detroit, Steve was Maurice's like first deputy there. So I remember like the first meeting that we're in for Detroit East Riverfront project, we're sitting in this big conference room and in walks Steve and was like, hey, like what's going on? We both remembered each other from NOMA. So like to those connections that you make as a student with professionals, carry those forward. And there's always people who are up to watch out and to share their experience and to have that sort of professional relationship. And then I would say also organizations outside of architecture. For me, like ULI has been tremendously helpful. And it's an organization that's primarily like developers and real estate investors and some architects and designers as well. But you get to learn a lot about the development industry. And it's helpful to have that knowledge as a designer. It'll kind of temper you a little bit and it'll allow you to understand, especially if you stay in like private practice, like, okay, what is your market as a private practitioner? What sectors are you going to aim for? What are the types and scales of projects that you want to work on? And there's so many opportunities out there and people that you'll kind of run into and connect with. And ULI has these like advisory panels that I've done. Like I did one in Fort Wayne, Indiana recently and ran into another architect that she interned at SOM as a student when she was at Virginia Tech. And it was like now 10 years later, she's a licensed architect and practicing in California. And we're like, oh, hey, what's up? So those like connections and relationships you build over time are just invaluable.
Oh, that's very good advice. I feel like I love NOMAS, for example. I feel like many of the people I have met through NOMAS, iNOMA, most of them have all become my mentors. They're also kind of like a little family to me.
Yes.
Because they're always like encouraging me, always asking me how I'm doing. And they will help me like if I need anything. So I feel like, especially in architecture, when you don't see too many people like around you that look like you have to really stick with the people who are going to support you no matter what, because they will probably give you the best advice and they're there no matter what. Like I said, they become your little family.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the conference is like a family reunion for sure. That's, that's the energy that it always has, and that's why it's like it's one of those things.
It's the cookout.
Look forward to. Yeah, it's like see my people and catch up and see what they're up to and run into them. Done amazing things. Helps you build like relationships. So like when I was at SOM, there were probably for a long time it was like me and one other black guy. Like we were the only black people that were there. There were I think 2 Latinas. There were more Asians because we had a lot of China work. So we had a lot of folks from either like China or South Korea. But there weren't the Southeast Asians, there weren't a ton of folks. It wasn't like super diverse. But like to have that conference and that space where you could be like, okay, let's connect with other folks, let's bring folks together, share opportunities that come to SM. Like I remember starting back, going to conference, and we set up a booth at the job fair or whatever. And like people were shocked. They were like, what? SOM is here? Like why? Like what's going on? Oh man, like, so it was really kind of refreshing to be there and like provide other folks opportunities that, sort of I had to kind of work at a pretty prominent firm and to do large scale projects. I think that's an opportunity that not a lot of folks have the venue to do. So to be there as like a conduit to like say like, hey, let's be more diverse. And, this is a pool of folks who are already doing that and are skilled and passionate about the work. And to be able to bring that into the office and to bring that to shape culture is like a huge thing. So that's like super important to be able to like take the energy that you get from NOMA and like bring that back to whatever practice you end up in, because it's like it helps the work and have a richness that they don't always have.
That's very well said. And before we end the episode, I have one more question for you.
All right.
What are your future goals?
Ooh. So my future goals, really, I am going to practice architecture again. I joined the city really to have an opportunity to learn, but also to give back to the place that I grew up and have so much sort of engagement and context with. But I did get this license, and I took all those exams for a reason. And it took me, I think, I passed the first 3 exams on the first go. But then the last 3 like kicked my butt a couple of times. So I had to take each of them like 3 times until I passed. But I got it done, and so now, I definitely want to practice again in the future and kind of take a lot of the things that I've learned from working in a big firm like SOM, working in the city, and then bring that back to shape a practice that is reflective of all of those values and vision. Because I think the difficulty with architecture practice now is it kind of does need a shake up. We're tremendously undervalued as a field, especially in comparison to things like the legal field and doctors and people who do the equivalent amount of schooling that we have to do and take all these exams and that sort of thing. We definitely need to be able to share the value that we have as a field just overall, but then to be able to leverage that to have impact on neighborhood and community, it's super important to me. So I still want to do larger scale projects. Definitely want to be able to have like impact as sort of the North Star of like how I want to continue to grow my career. Because I still got a lot of years left. So, but yeah, definitely will probably come back to practice at some point.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I hope to see you in practice later. Yeah, we'll definitely try to keep in touch, be in contact. And we appreciate having you as a guest on our podcast. It really does mean a lot. I feel like we don't really talk to too many urban planners. So this entire discussion was amazing. I was able to learn a lot, and I hope everyone who is listening feels the same way. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
I want to thank everyone who's listening. We release our episodes monthly. You can find us on your favorite podcast platform. You can also follow us on Instagram at BeyondTheSurface_NOMAS IIT. I want to thank our producer, Kayla Kwok, and the NOMAS IIT team for making this podcast possible. Thank you for listening to this episode of Beyond the Surface featuring Dawveed Scully. Until next time, goodbye.